Today is again March 28th, 2020, and this is the coronavirus pandemic Terminator series talks continuing, and we are going to resume from slide number 14. So we were talking about the social networking model and the flaws built in that thinking model in which an entire culture organizes its thoughts, its wisdoms, its sufferings, its miseries, its joys. And the built-in flaw in that model is that everyone assumes that there is a group of experts who are expert in each and every field, and they annually must meet, update each other's thoughts, and then share updated versions of that thought with everybody in the community. But as you can see, there are multiple flaws in that thought process. And we were talking about that same social networking model of thoughts that locked us into fossil fuels in the earlier part of the 20th century. And even though from 1970s onwards, we have had the technology for renewable energy, but it's very difficult to knock off a prevalent thinking model. And people with money who own fossil fuel industry obviously do not like to be knocked off that thought, and that's why the flawed thinking process continues generation after generation. And since planet is warming up, and there are clearly more wildfires in that social networking model of thought process, we have to ask ourselves, what percentage of Australia burning to the ground is acceptable? And what percentage of California burning to the ground is acceptable? How much Amazon can be burned down or should be burned down for cattle ranching so everyone can enjoy steak? Those are the kind of thoughts that never are put to a general public plebiscite or a ballot. And so those kind of thoughts usually are handled in the background, usually with the help of political leaders. And political leaders, I unfortunately hate to say, are also interested in their survival like the rest of us are. And their survival depends on people who support them for their re-election campaigns. And so those re-election campaigns is the meat and potatoes of the political world. So as a result, those people who are willing to support them with money, time, and energy are the ones who are going to have a seat in those kind of decision-making process. And how deep into the forested area should tribes in Africa encroach for bushmeat? That's another decision. Probably affects all of us, but but certainly those societies in Africa and some remote area tribes who are bordering between the wilderness and the urban environment or semi-urban rural environment. Those kind of decisions, even though made locally, affect internationally. Same way, how many and what variety of wild meats and animals are acceptable in Chinese markets and Chinese culture? That's a decision the Chinese culture and Chinese society is going to have to make. However, as you can see, that social networking model of thought process affects all of us. So no one human being, no community, no society really has time to think through these complex problems. And the vacuum is obviously created when no human being, no community, no society has time to think through these problems. And vacuum is very nicely and effectively filled by moneyed interests, people who gain to make a killing by tilting decision makers in a certain way. If you are a cattle rancher and you are willing to contribute the campaign of politicians in Brazil near the Amazon forest, Clearly, Brazilian politicians are going to listen to the people who are giving the money. So therein lies the flaw. And decision makers always, for their best interest to survive, they're always going to oblige campaign contributors as the first order of business. And that's unfortunately how it has always been. We have tried monarchies in the past. We have tried tribal leaders in the past. We have tried dictators, military juntas. None of them have ever really watched out for the interests of the general public. The democratic system of electing leaders is probably the best in the world, but that doesn't mean it does not have room for improvement. And one of the ways those decision makers, politicians who make decisions on all of our behalf, can be freed from the money interests is if the taxpayers fund the political campaigns and money interests are taken out of the decision-making capabilities. And then the other thing, which is very prevalent in human society, is the groupthink. Whatever the prevalent wisdom is, and usually the prevalent wisdom is enforced by some tribal chief, and we are going to this time use the example of the Iraq war in 2003, in March or April of 2003, when we invaded Iraq. Before that Iraq war, every day on TV, there was a discussion of a mushroom cloud, as if the mushroom cloud was going to happen over New York City day after tomorrow. And that's why the Bush administration was so much deeply concerned. And if you watch the body language of President George W. Bush before the Iraq war, he had a certain level of primate swagger in his walk and in his talk. And the high level, many people in high level administration, in Bush administration, including Vice President Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, had a knack for intimidating people, just like the alpha males in the primate primitive tribes intimidate, and were able to have the whole society comply with the groupthink. And the group thinking was able to be enforced. And an erroneous country and an erroneous war was led, in which we lost multiple trillions of dollars, and hundreds of thousands of American GIs were mentally and physically maimed, and millions of Iraqis are either internally displaced, externally displaced, killed, and a full civil war that ensued for almost 17 years over there and still ongoing. And now large part of the Middle East, Iraq, Syria are up in flames. So those are the downsides of the groupthink and the social model. And I'm going to briefly take you back to the primatology models that were developed by Jane Goodall and other primatologists. And my favorite recent primatologist, of course, is Dr. Robert Sapolsky, who very nicely delineates how human societies and primates, especially baboons, form these rankings. And the alpha males obviously like their top ranks, and alpha males can be vindictive, and they can extract a dear price and can intimidate very effectively most tribal members into submission. And that was largely visible during the Iraq war and its disastrous consequences. Most societies have very poor mechanisms of holding alpha males accountable. Remember the architects of Iraq war? Costs on both sides of the war in Iraq and Middle East, still civil wars, rampant, burning everywhere, and cost to the allies in terms of hundreds of thousands of our GIs maimed, mentally or physically, thousands of our soldiers killed, and nobody was held accountable. None of the alpha males ever had to come and account. Nobody ever had to come and tell us what was the urgency in the first place. Where was that mushroom cloud that they were seeing? Which intelligence agency was showing them the evidence that the mushroom cloud was going to fly over New York, California, Indianapolis, or any other American city? But nonetheless, Iraq war was waged. and none of the alpha males were held to account. Nobody ever went to jail. There were no hearings held, and in the end, nobody was held to account. So these kind of mistakes in the group model, in the social networking model of thinking and groupthink and alpha males would continue, and those flaws would be repeated again and again. And that kind of a structure of a society makes it very difficult for neo-thinkers, for people like me who like to sit down and think on these issues, very difficult to come forward. It's so much easier just to go with the flow. It sometimes feels like there are 7 billion people on this planet. All of them are going north and you are the only one going south. It's an extremely lonely journey, and there is a huge personal cost to try to go against the flow. A lot of the CIA analysts, including the ambassador, whose wife's name was Valerie Plame, who was outed by, I believe, by Scooter Libby or by the Bush administration, because they were trying to point out the flaws in the uranium yellow cake thinking of the Bush administration. And look at the personal cost they played, and almost all the CIA analysts who pointed out that there was cherry picking of the intelligence were essentially intimidated into silence. So for me to do this coronavirus pandemic Terminator series, there is a definite concern in terms of loss of my privacy. And clearly, I'm going to be stepping on toes of rich and powerful people, and a lot of alpha males start gunning for you. But nonetheless, there are thousands of people dying around the world, and I thought this is time for me to step out and at least share my thoughts with the world. And groupthink, again, is not one person's fault. There are systems that force everyone to fall into line, into conforming with group thinking. And we already talked about alpha males. And this alpha male behavior of intimidating others to conform has been very well documented by Jane Goodall's works and many, many other primatologists. And of course, my most recent favorite primatologist from Stanford University is Dr. Robert Sapolsky, who has spent thousands of hours in the field studying the behavior of baboons, and very nicely elucidates and delineates this kind of a behavior. And unfortunately, I hate to say, our human society is not structured that much differently than the baboon tribes. And that's where the scientific blind spots can develop. Standard advice of social distance and wash your hands, that's being given by almost all the health agencies of the world, is the best and the only advice. And I do not want anybody to deviate from that advice. Again, I repeat, I do not want anybody to deviate from that advice. Under the current circumstances, that is the best advice. So please stick with that advice. Again, I'm repeating again in bold capital letters, that is the best and the standard advice. So please stick with that. However, there are some flaws in that thinking, and I'm going to point that out. The few flaws in that model is model of how, excuse me, how far cough droplets can travel and land was developed in the 1940s during the days of tuberculosis or TB ravages. So that model of 6 feet distance, etc., is from an ancient time, almost 80 years old model. And in that model of coughing and cough droplets, when the scientists calculate, they never can calculate 100.000% with accuracy. So 80 to 90 or 95 or maybe even 99% of the cough droplets. So just like you saw me cough a minute back and I'm coughing, so my cough droplets are going to travel about 6 feet from here and are going to 80, 90, 95%, or even maybe 99% of those droplets are going to settle right in front of me over here. And of course, the camera is coming from the computer, you can see. And the whole computer, keyboard, and everything on this table around me is going to be contaminated. But what about the less than 1% of the droplets, maybe 10%, 15% of the model? Those droplets are going to keep flying around, and we are going to focus our energy on those droplets in a minute. And since this video has continued for about 16 minutes, so we are going to go ahead and pause that, and we'll resume that. And we are ending this video with slide number 18, and we'll pick it up from slide number